guys, welcome back to News in a Nutshell for a very unique episode. Today we are going to be discussing Prime Minister Narendra Modi's agenda for the 2024 elections, and we are going to be basically compiling the last few speeches that the Prime Minister has given, specifically the speech that he gave in the last Parliament session, where a lot of drama happened, but we are not going to get into all of that. We're going to focus specifically on the BJP agenda and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's agenda. So let's get into it. Now, the first thing that the Prime Minister brought up, which we should be discussing, is this idea that he has of the next 1,000 years or an agenda for the next 1,000 years of India's progression, which ironically reminds me of another guy from history who used to speak of the 1,000-year Reich. But I am not going to name names and I'm not going to make those comparisons. So, yeah, basically the point that I'm trying to make is that for a government, like any government in the world, it is very difficult to decide what the agenda is for the next 4 years or 5 years. Sometimes it's even very difficult to build an agenda for 1 year because most governments are unable to predict a lot of complications that arise, and things progress the way they do and the governments adjust accordingly. So for somebody to say that we are going to come up with a strong 1,000-year agenda for India's progression is a little impractical, and it is more rhetoric than it is something that is practically applicable. So I think as Indian citizens, this is something that we should listen to and maybe be excited by, but take with a pinch of salt. Anyway, the Prime Minister also spoke of the last 1,000 years of India's history, which he called the 1,000 years of slavery. Now, I do not appreciate that statement as an Indian citizen, but his ideology is that from the time when Muhammad bin Qasim went to battle with the king of Sindh, Raja Dahir, since then, foreign invaders, specifically Muslims in his words, so Muslim invaders have been a major part of Indian history, and they have affected the Indian demographic and politics to a very large extent, and in a way subjugated the native population of India. So he's talking about these instances in history. And to a certain extent, that might be true, but there were also Muslim leaders that came to power who did a lot of good things for the people of India and the Muslim population as well. Also, it should be considered that a major chunk of the Indian Muslim population today are people who converted to Islam at that point of history because they found Islam to be a better option than their religions at that point, because they did not want to conform to the caste system and they found themselves being subjugated within their own religion. So there are a lot of complexities to this, and I think it is not simple enough to say that India has been enslaved for the last 1,000 years. Another thing that the Prime Minister spoke of in this particular part of the speech was the British rule and how the British took over India, and then after the Muslim rulers, the British subjugated the Indian citizens and basically enslaved them. So I do not disagree with that. I think enslaving is a little strong. I think as people with self-respect, we should not think that we were enslaved. But I do agree with the idea that the British exercised a lot of power and did a lot of bad things, stole a lot of resources from India, and basically treated Indians as second-class citizens in their own country. So, yeah, I have no disagreement with that part of the statement. The one thing I will say, though, is that I do not believe in this victimhood ideology being mongered, especially by the right wing or the BJP aligned groups or the BJP itself. The one thing that we fail to notice is that even though the British were a very, very bad thing to happen to India, they did bring the Indian subcontinent together and make us capable of being a nation today. Because if you go back in history, you will realize the Indian subcontinent was a group of warring states and kingdoms that had never come together. Even before the Muslim rulers arrived, there were sections in Indian history where the Cholas or Chandragupta Maurya or certain empires were able to basically bring a large portion of the Indian subcontinent together, but nobody had ever brought about a long age where India was one particular nation that functioned as one particular nation. There was always infighting, there were always kingdoms fighting each other, and the British rule was the first time in history where Indians as individuals decided to come together because they had a common enemy to stand against. So yes, the British were horrible. The British did very bad things. They looted our country and they ill-treated our people. But they were an experience that I believe Indians needed to be what we are today and to consider ourselves one nation and one people. So instead of saying that we were victims and mongering that victimhood ideology, I would much rather see some leader from the right or the left or some centrist leader talk about the fact that there is a silver lining to that whole process, and that India is now a country, a secular country, which has individuals that stand for one ideology patriotically, and that is something that we have gained from our past experiences. So that is something to think on. Anyway, the Prime Minister also spoke of the last 75 years of independence, and he spoke of how limiting those years have been. In a way, he was glorifying his own rule in the last decade or so, but he was trying to cast a shadow on, say, the Vajpayee government or the governments that the Congress brought in before that, or other parties brought in. So basically, he was speaking of how weak the governments were before his own government, and we'll talk a little more about that later. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that I believe the geopolitical situations that India was facing after independence and during the partition and then after the partition and so on and so forth were such that governments did what they could and tried to manage the situation as well as they could. And like any government, even the Modi government today, the governments of the past made some good decisions and made some bad decisions, and what we got was a mixed bag of that. And for today's government to say, oh, those governments made very stupid decisions and they did not do anything great in the last 75 years is quite disrespectful to the people of this nation and to the history of India, in my opinion. Because you have also made mistakes as the government in power in the center. You have also brought out policies that the people of this country have pushed back on and literally thrown in the bin. So everything that you have done has not been an absolute hit either. But there are certain things that the current government has done which have served the nation well. So the situation was the same in the past, and the situation is quite similar now because every government has its positives and negatives. So I would take this statement with a pinch of salt because this government isn't perfect either. So I do not believe the Prime Minister is in any position to question past governments. And I also believe that this is a very childish thing to do, to speak about the past and try and glorify yourself. Instead of that, maybe the current government should focus on what they have done well and try and improve their own policies so that they can stand on their own without comparison. Anyway, so there were three main points that the Prime Minister spoke of beyond this, in which he delineated what his specific agenda is for the next elections and what are the basic principles on which he will be speaking and fighting these elections. So the number one thing that the Prime Minister spoke of was corruption in India, and he spoke of how him coming to power again, or his government coming to power again, will be a good way for India to tackle corruption, which I found quite amusing because his government has been in power in the center for more than a decade now. So in a way, he was saying that corruption is still a very big issue and we haven't been able to deal with it in a decade plus. But if you bring us to power again, we will definitely deal with it. I find that kind of silly, to be very, very honest. But it is what it is. Corruption at some level always remains, and every government to a certain extent is corrupt. So I am not trying to say that another government coming in will kill corruption, but yes, we should take this with a pinch of salt as well, because if you cannot finish or at least reduce corruption to a large degree in a decade plus, then you're not going to be doing it in the next 4 years either. So this is more of a platitude than anything else. Then the Prime Minister spoke of dynastic rules, which again is kind of ironic, because if you consider the Scindias who have moved to the BJP now, and if you consider, say, the Naddas or Amit Shah's family, who are all involved in BJP politics to a certain extent, it is amusing to say that the Gandhis through Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi, and then the dynasty that followed, are a dynastic rule, or that the opposition government is built upon dynastic rule, because this is the reality of any party and its structure. Most individuals who are a part of the party senior structure and management will always try and push somebody from their family into politics, because they can transfer their voter base and the backing that they have and all of the resources and the money they have accumulated over the years, and put them into the hands of somebody that is from their own family. So this happens in the BJP as well, and we see it happening as of now. And this obviously happens on the opposition side as well, because the Prime Minister is attacking them for it again and again, and he has been doing it for the past decade. So yeah, I find this is quite silly, because if you are doing the same thing, how can you question the other side for doing it? Either you completely drop all of the dynastic rules that you have built up in different states of India, and then you talk about it, or you do not talk about it at all, because for anybody with a keen eye, you are basically indicting yourself in the process. Now, the third point that the Prime Minister spoke of when he was talking about his agenda was the appeasement of Muslim minorities, which he said was something that the past governments engaged in extensively. And this too is going to tie into some later points, so this is going to contradict itself again. But the one thing that I would say is that with this two-pronged attack that we have seen up till now, that has mentioned Muslims twice specifically rather than any other community, and it's not been in a very good light, it does seem like that whole ideology, or that slogan of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vishwas, or Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, is not really applicable when it comes to the practical aspects of the center's functioning. Because if you genuinely want Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, then do not attack certain communities that are a part of your nation. Maybe try and bring them into the fold as well. I do understand what the Prime Minister is trying to do here, because his voter base is majorly non-Muslim, and by pitting Muslims against other communities, this does bolster up his base, especially the majority of his base, which is quite right-wing and anti-Muslim. So yes, politically speaking, this is a good tactic, but for anybody who is looking at this practically, it is quite questionable, because I do not see him having a firm stand in this particular case. So he basically is leaning towards whichever side suits his political motives, and I will leave it at that. Another thing that he spoke of was the past coalition governments, which he called weak. And yes, to a certain extent, coalition governments are weak. But then he went on to praise his majoritarian government as well. And in all honesty, having a majoritarian government, the kind of which the BJP has built up, is an impressive endeavor. And it does do a lot of good things in certain sections of policy making, because if there is a policy that is required and is appreciated by the people, then a majoritarian government has the ability to push it through the parliament and push it through the legislative structure quicker, and they can make sure that the opposition cannot stop that policy's progress just because they are the opposition and they want to stand against any policy. Having said that, the BJP government at the center, as a majoritarian government, has shown a trend of bringing in policies that the people of India do not appreciate, and the people of India have time and again taken those policies, thrown them up and thrown them into the bin and pushed back against them. So there is a positive to a majoritarian government and there is a positive to a coalition government as well, because in a coalition government you have different sections or different groups or parties that have come together to build one majority, and in the process, when you are trying to push a policy through, you have to take into account the opinions of every section, which is a representation of different sections and populations of India. So it is a far more holistic and wholesome approach to policy making. Granted, it sometimes takes a lot of time and often can lead to a lot of chaos, but it does take the requirements of multiple groups into consideration rather than one majority pushing its will and policy on the whole country. So yes, take the positives for what they are and take the negatives for what they are. Another aspect that the Prime Minister spoke of, which was quite interesting and could have an influence on his elections if he does not learn from history, was his idea of the duties of a citizen. And please pay attention to the word duties, because I did not say the rights of a citizen, I said the duties of a citizen towards his nation. Now, as much as we would like to say that yes, every citizen should fulfill his duties towards his nation, there are structured rights given to citizens, but there are no structured duties given to the citizens of this country, and I will tell you why this is an important aspect of this speech. So, in Indira Gandhi's time, in the 6th year of her government, she did the same thing and spoke of the duties of the citizens of India while she initiated a state of emergency in which the parliament delayed the elections and gave India the 42nd Amendment. Now, that was how she began this whole process, by talking about the duties that every Indian has towards his nation or her nation, and why in this state of emergency there are certain things that the people of India have to do for the betterment of their country. Now, considering all of that, considering the fact that the elections were delayed and Indira Gandhi managed to stay in power, avoiding an election that she was likely to lose, and brought in the 42nd Amendment, which then abrogated the constitution, suspended fundamental rights of citizens, and allowed the parliament or the government to pass laws in the parliament which were immune to scrutiny from opposition parties. So if you look at that, basically in the guise of giving people certain duties and trying to push them towards that ideology, Indira Gandhi brought in the 42nd Amendment, took away people's fundamental rights, initiated a state of emergency, abrogated the constitution, and then did whatever she wanted to do and pushed any policy through the parliament without allowing the opposition to scrutinize or question it. And this is something that the majoritarian BJP government is already doing, because they do push laws through and shut the opposition out because of their majority in the parliament. Another aspect of this is that because the policies of the BJP government are mostly catered towards the right wing of the country or the right wing of the political spectrum, the fundamental rights of people are often trampled. So people are often arrested or charged with sedition for saying things against the government or questioning government policies, or sometimes even joking about the government or an individual in power. So you do see this decline in fundamental rights for citizens. And yes, right now the right wing might be happy about this because they see the left losing its fundamental rights and being affected by it. But the fact of the matter is that fundamental rights apply to every citizen of India, whether you are on the left of the spectrum or the right, or whether you're a centrist like me, you have the same fundamental rights. So if the government is taking away the fundamental rights of citizens, then they're not just doing it to the left, they will also apply those same lack of rights to you. And tomorrow, if you are in need of exercising your fundamental rights as a right wing individual, you will not be able to do so. So this is not good for anybody, regardless of which end of the spectrum you are on. And out of all of the things I've spoken of, I think this is the one thing that the citizens of India should vehemently stand against, because this is not a question of whether you are you like Hindutva and you agree with that ideology and you like the BJP, or you like the Congress and you're a leftist, or you're a liberal, or you're a centrist. This is about the rights that everybody on any end of the spectrum should have, and they should never be suspended or taken away. Now, what happened, if we look back in history, was when Indira Gandhi brought in the 42nd Amendment and took away fundamental rights and did all of those things. The people of India obviously were not happy about it because they were suffering because of it, and they stood up against Indira Gandhi. She got kicked out of power and the Janata Party came into power. So if the BJP and the Prime Minister are not careful of how far they go with this policy or these ideologies, they also might see a heavy backlash, because at a certain point when their own voter base starts suffering because of a lack of rights and because of certain policies, even they will start standing up against the BJP. And that is something that the BJP should keep in mind. The next thing that the Prime Minister spoke of was India's progression from his particular perspective, and India's stature, or the coming stature that India will have of being the third largest economy in the world, which I do not see as a major achievement. And you might be shocked by that statement, but please hear me out. So, the one thing that everybody with common sense can agree upon is that the previous government under Prime Minister under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh saw the best economic growth that the country had, and in Prime Minister Modi's time the economic growth has dropped. You see the effect in the prices of fuel rising, you see the effect in the prices of basic commodities rising, and you also see the effect in other aspects of the Indian economy. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, even though the economic growth of India has dropped off significantly under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and that is not a good thing at all, we are still growing at a rate where we will become the third largest economy in due time, say in the next 5 to 10 years anyway. So to pat yourself on the back for destroying the excellent economic growth that we were seeing before the BJP government came to the center is not a very practical thing to do, because not only are you bolstering yourself for bringing down the economic growth rate, you're also saying, oh, we will become the third largest economy. Well, you would have become the third largest economy anyway, regardless of how low you bring the economic growth rate. The basic rate at which India is growing will make it the third largest economy regardless. So this has nothing to do with anything you have managed to achieve as a power in the center. And I think that needs to be brought to people's attention, because the rhetoric makes it sound very nice that, oh, okay, India is going to be the third largest economy and we have done it. But the fact of the matter is, you have brought the growth rate down, so you have not really done it. You're basically riding on the coattails of the good work that was done before you, which is still, even though the growth rate is dropping, is still sustaining you after a decade in power where you have not been able to replicate that kind of economic growth. So yes, please, before you start jumping in your seats and getting happy about this, please think about that, because number one, we would have been the third largest economy regardless, and number two, we should not be looking at that as a marker, because considering the size of the Indian nation and the size of India's population, even as the third largest economy, we will not be a developed nation. We will still be a developing nation with a lot of poor people and a major lack of resources, especially in rural areas. So the aim should be to become a developed nation and not just put a number next to the nation of India and say, oh, that is an achievement. And that is something I would like the Modi government to speak about, because what is the agenda beyond that? Yes, you are going to be third anyway, regardless of what you do. You could tank the economy today and we will still be third. So what is it that you're going to do beyond that? How are you going to influence the Indian economy in the future if you come to power? That is a question I want answered, and you should also want answered as citizens of this country. Now, the next thing that the Prime Minister spoke of was the large population of our country, and specifically the population the younger population of our country, which is extensive. So if you look at other nations in the world, especially developing nations or a country like developed nations or a country like China, which are economically quite strong, we see that they have a lack of a young generation now, because they have more older people who are, for the lack of a better word, drains on the economy, because old people do not bring a lot into the economy, they take a lot out of the economy. They take out money for their retirement, they take out their investments so that they can spend them in their retirement. They do not invest as much because they're not working, they do not put as much into the active economy, and they do not pay as much in taxation as the younger generations do. So because of this, having a large young population is a very good thing for the economy of a nation, because you can use that to bolster the economy and expand it, which is something that India has. So yes, this is something that I do appreciate, although this has nothing to do with whichever government is in power. This has to do with the ability of Indian people to go to their bedrooms and make babies. So yeah, I don't think this has much to do with political parties. Anyway, the next point that the Prime Minister spoke of was the diversity of India and how much he appreciates it. After dunking on Muslims twice, he decided to appreciate India's diversity. And then he specifically started mentioning the Sikhs and their contributions to India historically and even at this point, and how the Sikhs are a brilliant section of the Indian population who do so much for the country. And that made me laugh a little bit, because after dishing out so much sauce on the opposition for appeasing the Muslims, he went on a tangent and spent a long time appeasing the Sikhs. And I understand why he is doing this, because the BJP has broken into 9 states that they were traditionally not powerful in, and have formed governments in those 9 states within the last decade or so of them being in power in the center. And their aim now and for a long time has been to break into Punjab, which has been a stronghold that they haven't even been able to make a dent in. And it has to be mentioned that they kind of shot themselves in the foot by introducing the farm laws, and that did not do much for them when it came to their influence in Punjab. And considering the fact that Punjab was not fan of Narendra Modi or the BJP even before that, I do not see how the BJP is going to be making any considerable inroads into Punjab, unless they do something very unique and special, and all of a sudden they can influence the hearts and minds of the people of Punjab. So yeah, I mean, try as they might, I do not see them breaking into Punjab in any significant way at any front as of now. So let's see if his appeasement tactics work better than the Gandhi's appeasement tactics did. Sorry. Sometimes I can't help myself from laughing. Another thing that he spoke of was rescuing copies of the Guru Granth Sahib from Afghanistan, when Afghanistan saw the American army leaving and the Taliban taking over again. And he also spoke of how the Sikhs have been a major help to the country through their social service during the pandemic and otherwise as well, by offering people food and langars and offering people medicines and trying to do good for the country, which is great. Yeah, I appreciate all of that. I do appreciate the Sikh community for doing that, and yeah, there are no two ways about that. So it is what it is. If we go on further, the Prime Minister spoke of India's leadership role in the international fraternity, and he spoke of India as, in his words, as Vishwa Gurus, which is, to me, it sounds like a great thing if we can genuinely achieve that. As of now, though, I do not see India having achieved that status. Yes, India has a lot more political influence and economic influence even than it did before, especially because of the strong pharmaceutical industry that India has and the ability for India to grow economically. But the fact of the matter is that the reason why Western countries are trying to please India and are saying nice things about India is because they are trying to extricate themselves from the Chinese economy, which has become a hostile economy, and China has shown the West that they will use their ability to influence and to a large extent absolutely ruin Western economies to make sure that the West aligns with their ideologies and policies. So to counter that, the West is now trying its best to pull out of China, and India is the only other option which provides them with the human resource, the economic growth ability, and the surface area, landmass, and ability to expand economically at an industrial front the way China was offering to the West. So that is a major part of why India's stature in the international fraternity has now started rising, and it does not have as much to do with foreign policy particularly, even though I have to say that our foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, is an excellent foreign minister, and he has some very clear ideas. But what I speak of is that the policies that are being made at the center, where India is still trying to appease all sides and will talk to Russia the same way it will talk to China, the same way it will talk to Pakistan, the same way it will talk to America, the same way it will talk to Ukraine. And that whole policy of international appeasement is great, but then eventually it will cause disharmony with other nations, because certain nations will take a stand and will ask India to pick a side. And that is something that India has to think about, because then eventually all of this growth on the international front in stature will then cease or be limited, because if you do not pick the right side, then you have problems. So that is something India has to think about, and it has to be careful about maintaining that balancing act and keeping its relationships cordial with all the countries in the world, regardless of which side they fall on, whether it's the Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc. Another thing the Prime Minister spoke of was the Pasmanda Muslims, who are the backward castes that historically converted to the Muslim religion. And well, this could just be a coincidence, but the Pasmandas make the largest section of the Muslim community, much as the lower castes make the largest section of the Hindu community. So you can guess why the Prime Minister is speaking fondly of them before elections. But I will leave that up to you. What I find a little amusing is the fact that after attacking the Muslim community twice, or attacking the previous governments for appeasing Muslims, all of a sudden he is in love with the Sikhs and he is in love with the Pasmanda Muslims. So I see a little bit of duality here, which is something that I personally do not appreciate. But I do understand the political ramifications of not pleasing certain groups and not speaking against your opposition. So I guess this is part of politics, and it is what it is. We must take this with a pinch of salt and make our own assessments on whether we appreciate this or not. Okay, so a thing that the Prime Minister did not speak about, that I want to point out, is national security. And along with national security, he did not mention foreign policy. The reason why I want to talk about these things is because, well, number one, if we remember the Pulwama incident, and we remember how that influenced the elections that came after that, and how it helped the BJP swing votes in its favor, we do understand that national security and foreign policy were major portions of that particular election. Considering the situation that India finds itself in now, with China up in arms on one front and Pakistan becoming a failed state where different sections and different tribes are basically fighting it out for political control and power, with the army on one side and the ISI on the other side, and Imran Khan and his political party or other political parties on the other side, and terrorist groups on certain sides. It is a huge mess. Considering all of that, considering the state that the world finds itself in, India now should be talking about its national security and foreign policy, and the Prime Minister should be mentioning these things, because if he wants to get elected again, then it is very important for the people of this nation to know which direction he wants to go in. and at some point I would like to see him talk about it, because I want to know what his perspective on it is, because this is not something that we can ignore. Out of all of the things that he spoke about, some of them being amusing, some of them being ironic, some of them actually being well put together ideas and thoughts, this one thing that he did not speak about is actually the most important aspect of the Indian subcontinent's future, and should be the most important aspect of the 2024 elections. So yes, as an Indian citizen myself, I do believe that this is something that should be brought out, and the center, specifically Prime Minister Narendra Modi, should speak on this. And you should think so too, because this is your country, you live in it, and its national security and foreign policy is very, very important for your future as well. Anyway, that is my piece, and I hope you like the video. Please like, share, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you think about this particular video and what I've said in it. Please tell me what your thoughts are on the 2024 elections and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's speeches and his agendas. Tell me what you think about the opposition as well, and I will try and work on a video talking about the opposition and its approach of what it should do for the next elections. And regardless of whether you are a leftist or whether you are on the right or whether you're a centrist like me, please do comment and let me know what you think. You're welcome to attack me if you want. I don't mind. And you're welcome to support me in my ideologies if you want. Regardless, yeah, I am open for a conversation, and see you next time. Thank you.